Okay.
Yeah.
I think we're live.
Linwood is also trying to get his video functioning. Yeah.
Yes, I'm. I think Linwood, you should be able to share your video right now.
Okay, let me try. Yeah, there I am.
There you are.
Fantastic.
Exactly.
Thank you. Okay.
Brilliant.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our panelists and to our attendees. I think maybe I'm just going to give just a few more seconds for everyone to get in, as I can see the attendee count is still going up. So we're going to begin in just a few moments. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this roundtable session hosted by the Union for Radical Political Economy. My name is Hanna Szymborska from Birmingham City University in the UK, and I will be chairing today's session. I hope that you are all doing well and staying safe. Wherever you are in the world, I'm aware that for some of you it's morning, the next day, for some of you it's the evening, for some of you it's the afternoon. So we are very grateful for all of you who could join us today. Today we have an incredible session with several really distinguished panelists to share their views on the important topic of diversity and inclusion in economics profession, scholarship, as well as the curriculum. And we are hoping for a lot of engagement and interactions from you, the audience, as well. The roundtable has been organized by members of the steering committee of Diversifying and Decolonizing Economics, or DECON, including Ariana Agunsoye, Surbi Kesser, Ingrid Krangraben, and myself. To begin with, I would like to say, first of all, how grateful we are to our panelists for agreeing to join this roundtable and take the time to speak today. We're really, really grateful, and we really appreciate it. And we would also like to thank the URPE program coordinators, Mona and Jared, for making this roundtable possible. So without further ado, I would like to invite Ingrid to open the roundtable with a few words about DECON and why we are discussing today the problem of the lack of diversity in heterodox economics specifically, especially that, as you will know, there are already several other sessions on diversity and inclusion in the profession at this conference. So Ingrid, over to you.
Thank you, Hannah. And hi, everyone. So as Hannah said, this is organized by a few of us in DECON. So before we go into talking about how to address the problems that we see, we just want to present a little bit about what DECON is and the problems that we see, and also who we are and how we came to be. So let me see. So who we are, we're students and scholars from across the world that came together in joint frustration with discrimination in the field and the Western-centric nature of the field. I think we started organizing 3 or 4 years ago informally, and then we launched DECON officially in 2019. And it's constantly expanding. We're getting new members all the time. It's a kind of very non-hierarchical group. So you can join, anyone can join a working group or steering group meetings. We really welcome engagement. This is we see it as something that we need more manpower to do to address all of these problems. And we really welcome new members. So what we see, the problem that we saw and that we're trying to address in DECON is first we saw a lack of diversity in our field. So we all come from sort of a heterodox economics background. Of course, we see the monolithic mainstream that excludes the heterodox approaches. But also within the heterodoxy, we see a lack of diversity as well in terms of lack of women, lack of people of color, lack of people from the global south. And on top of that, so that's kind of identity and content, but we also see that in terms of content, there's also a Western-centric approach in a lot of heterodox economic theory as well. So this is something that isn't just, I mean, it's of course it's about challenging the economics field as a whole, but it's also about challenging, you know, the subfield that we're a part of, heterodox economics. So that's very briefly. We can come. I'm sure we'll come back to all of these issues. So in terms of identity, it's become increasingly clear in the field that there's this problem of missing women, and of course, this is approached, like the reasons for that is seen as very different in the mainstream and heterodox economics, and there's a lot of disagreement about why there's a low percentage of women in economics, but finally there is agreement that there is, it's getting more recognition that there's not enough women in economics, even in the mainstream. And that was particularly clear with Alice Wu's paper, which came out just around the same time as the Me Too movement as well. So 90% of women economists worldwide are, 90% of economists are women worldwide. And of course, non-white scholars are underrepresented in the US and the UK. In the US and the UK, both 30% of women, 30% of undergraduate students are women. So already at the very beginning, we start with a low percentage, and then with this leaky pipeline, the percentage is reduced as you go on to master's, PhD, lecturer, assistant professor, and professor level. And then, of course, we see this as being rooted in discrimination. So it's not just, as you know, a lot of the Financial Times and the New York Times have been reporting on this, like missing women and missing people of color in the economics field, as being partly about a choice that women just aren't that interested in economics. But we think that it's, and there's a lot of research that shows that, you know, it's very clear that there is a lot of discrimination against women and people of color. Women face higher publishing standards than men, are less likely to be given credit for their work, have a harder time getting tenure, and even face a lengthier peer review process. There was this research paper that showed, and we'll put this slide on our website later, so you can click on the links and read the research papers behind these facts. Also, here's some statistics in the second point from the UK about Black female professors facing bullying, stereotyping, institutional neglect. And in the UK, where there's more research on this, UK Black academics experience greater scrutiny, they're paid less, and they're less successful in applying for promotions. So there's a lot of sort of research coming up about the discrimination in economics in the UK and the US in particular. And so far, the mainstream has been quite active in researching and discussing this issue the past few years. But their approach has tended to focus on individual preferences, and SysWIP, of course, always has these mentoring sessions at the ASSA, which is great, but we think that this is inadequate, because that's basically just, you know, trying to get women to fit into the structures that are already there instead of trying to challenge the structures themselves. In terms of Eurocentrism, this is something that I know some of you were at the session yesterday, where we discussed at length how, you know, this is a very old problem that comes from the development of economics, and these historical processes of colonialism and later imperialism have led to this limited understanding of what counts as expertise. And in economics today, economists often claim that they're neutral, that their theories are universal, whereas this ignores all the political battles about economic processes and the political nature and the colonial nature of economics. So we are calling for acknowledging theories that come from outside of the West as well. For example, dependency theory, there's a bunch of different theories that we could talk about that Serbi talked about a lot yesterday. And Komarov make this argument in this book that if we look at non-Western theories, we can also use them to explain theories, explain things that are happening in the West. You know, it's not just about using theories, non-Western theories, to look at what's going on in the non-Western world. We can actually, you know, of course, also learn about how to look at the world in the West as well. And dependency theory is a case in point. There's a lot of scholars now in the EU using a dependency theory lens to understand the inequalities in the EU. So of course, why does it matter? Well, of course, it's unfair because discrimination is unfair. Eurocentrism is unfair. But beyond that, there are also other reasons. Discrimination affects quality because it excludes scholars and viewpoints that could otherwise have provided, very important insights. And also marginalized groups are more likely to bring viewpoints that would otherwise be absent or undervalued. So for example, just going back to the dependency theory example, those theories were originated in the developing world, in the periphery, as they would say, because they saw the world from a different perspective. So they were able to develop theories about the global inequality. Right, and you can see the same with feminist economics as well, that women are more likely to recognize and engage with problems associated with excluding household work from GDP, for example. And there was also this paper in 2018 that showed that women economists are more likely to consider labor market opportunities to be unequal than men. So again, your viewpoint actually leads you to see the world in a different way. So excluding certain groups leads us to lose these viewpoints that could enrich the way we see the economy. So therefore, we're saying fighting for heterodox economics is important, but that itself isn't enough. So just to highlight that, since we're in an URPE session, to go beyond the we need heterodox economics, we need more heterodox economics mantra, which we also do, but yeah. So that was very briefly about decon. I can talk a little bit more at the end about how we're trying to do these things, like what concrete action points. But this was just a general overview to give some background to what we're doing and why we're doing it. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. And I would now like to invite our panelists to give their opening statements. And after that, we will proceed to the Q&A with all the attendees. So please, dear attendees, start thinking about questions that you'd like to ask our panelists. And you will be able to either type them in the chat area or in the Q&A. I'm not sure if we can have you speak out loud. I will double check that. But in the meantime, I would like to first invite Professor Lee Badgett to give her opening statement. Of course, our panelists need no introduction, but just for the sake of highlighting their incredible work on the topic, I'm going to read out a brief bio for each of our speakers. Lee Badgett is a professor of economics and co-director of the Center for Employment Equity at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and the former director of the School of Public Policy. She is also a Williams Distinguished Scholar at the UCLA's Williams Institute, and she was also a co-founder and the first research director of that organization. She also chairs the American Economic Association's Committee on the Status of LGBTQ Individuals in the Economics Profession. She has a PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley, and her research focuses on economic inequality for LGBT people, including wage gaps, employment discrimination, and poverty, and on the global cost of homophobia and transphobia. And we are very pleased to say that she is also the advisory board member for DECON. Over to you, Lee.
Great, thank you so much, Ingrid, and for everybody at DECON for organizing this. It's such an important topic. I also want to mention that I am on the AEA's Committee on Equity, Diversity, and Professional Conduct. And I guess I wanted to start there and make 4 just kind of general opening points. So the first one is, we did this survey last year of the AEA membership around issues related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we got some very bad news. It was maybe not surprising, but it certainly was bad news. People from all different kinds of marginalized groups in our profession face enormous challenges. These are challenges that can have very bad personal effects related to discrimination, sexual harassment, and taking avoidance behaviors to try to avoid running into those kinds of experiences. And that's bad for our profession, because a lot of that involves people exiting places where we need them, seminars, applying for jobs, applying for grad schools and different kinds of programs. So we got a lot of a very clear view of just how hard our profession is for women in general, for women of color, for men of color, for LGBTQ people, for people with disabilities, for people who are not from the US. There are many different kinds of layers of challenges. And so that in and of itself is like a lifetime's work for all of us. On top of that, actually, I think one of the most important points was that there is just very generally a lot of pain generally in our profession. So if you ask people in our profession about whether they're satisfied with the overall climate in economics, only about 1/3 of people say yes, they're satisfied with it. If you ask whether people personally feel valued in the field of economics, only 40% of people who responded to this question said, yes, I feel valued in my profession. To me, this was completely shocking that we have created a culture that's bad for everybody. And I don't think those things are disconnected, that it's bad for women, people of color, queer people, and it's bad for everybody else, because there's no way you can have a culture that is diverse, that is inclusive, that isn't, I think, good generally for everybody. It has one of the things I learned from reading the open-ended responses to that survey was that a lot of this is about elitism, about the feeling that people have that they are just, by the nature of their professional birth, whatever program they come from, whatever university they attend, they are, they're sort of slotted into a role that they can't actually jump out of. And as a result of that, I think there's a lot of resentment about our discussions about diversity and inclusion. And people said things like, unless you're a woman, you can't get hired in my department. And, this seems to be one of those things that's kind of demonstrably untrue when you look at a lot of different departments. But it's led to some people being more resentful. But I think, on the other hand, it's led to other people being much more open to change. I guess the second thing I'll say is just a lot of us have been working on these things for decades, for more than 30 years. In my case, when I was in grad school, we did all sorts of things that actually turned out to make a big difference. We pushed back when people resorted to stereotypes, sometimes using their own data to show them they were wrong when they said, minority graduate students would take too many resources. People actually said that, and that was demonstrably untrue in our own data and our program. We picketed our department, not something I would recommend for everybody to do, but we picketed them because they were not hiring women and people of color, and we got them to make changes. So I think, we have to think about this as an organizing project. The third thing I will say is, in terms of teaching and research, we also, at the same time that we're doing that organizing, we have to do the work that we came here to do. And for a lot of us, that is about changing our profession and about changing the lives of people who are like us and what they live in, no matter what our identities are, or people whose well-being we are committed to. So that's an important piece of our work as well, to create the space for students who are students of color, who are women, who are LGBT, etc. And that can be very hard to do too. That's hard in mainstream economics, and it is hard in heterodox economics. I want to know who put the hetero in heterodox economics, because there's still a lot of invisibility of LGBTQ people, for instance. That's the work that I focus on. Invisibility is not something that's natural or inherent. It's something that happens because people are devalued and because research is blocked. Knowledge is not sought after. We're told it's not economics. We're told it's just identity politics. It doesn't deal with kind of underlying issues that we are concerned about in heterodox economics. It's because LGBTQ people are this affluent elite group of people, again, relying on stereotypes. So we have all the same problems within our own profession that we study in the world outside. But we have to remember to save at least some of our organizing energy to do that work internally, because our profession is important. We are influential, and we want to use that influence for good. So, so I'm excited to be here for this conversation today. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you for being right on time. Next up, we have Lynn Chester. Lynn is an associate professor in the Department of Political Economy at the University of Sydney in Australia. She has previously advised the Australian government and has consulted for several governmental agencies and the Asian Development Bank. She was also a senior executive with 2 of Australia's largest utilities. She received her PhD from the University of New South Wales. Her work includes the empirical application of regulation theory, particularly in the energy sector, centering on the economic energy-environment relation, household energy affordability, energy justice, energy problematization, and economic regulation. And she is also the advisory board member of DECON. So over to you, Lynn.
Hannah, and thank you very much for the opportunity of being here. Sorry for the scratchy voice, but I'm 16 hours behind the US, and so my time zones are very, very different. I've only had 1 coffee this morning. Hannah referred to my background prior to academia, and that informs very much, I think, my views about heterodoxy. And it takes me very much to Ingrid's final statement about fighting for heterodox economics is important, but it's not enough. My experience, my previous pre-academic employment experience and my academic experience has reinforced for me the poor state that heterodox economics is in when it comes to identities and diversity. I'm very privileged to be in the Department of Political Economy at the University of Sydney in a group of, you would think, like-minded economists. But as a group, it suffers as much as the mainstream does. And it's quite deep-seated in the sense of what I would call culture and quite white male culture about decision-making, about curricula, about recruitment processes, about what is needed at various times, even in terms of, and recently we did the annual Wheelwright lecture, which Jayita participated in, even making decisions about those sorts of forums. And I mentioned that, and I come down to that sort of day-to-day level, because this is what I think one of the most fundamental things we need to confront. It is these embedded institutional and cultural structures in the academy. And if we are going to actually achieve on an ongoing basis, and I really want to stress this, we're not going to have an end state that suddenly heterodoxy and the mainstream will sort itself out in terms of identities. It is going to be an ongoing, as it has been, as Lee mentioned, she's been working on this for decades. It's an ongoing project. We do not achieve an end state of where we want to be because there is constantly new generations that we need to be having as part of this inclusion and conversation. And I think that's been overlooked a lot in the past, so that heterodoxy has become dominated by older white men. Now, I'm an older white woman, but I find constantly it's the same olds, older white men that dominate a lot of what I would say the communities, the heterodox communities organisation and practices. And perhaps when we get into our Q&A, I'll give you some examples quite close to home in some of the journals, the heterodox journals and the publications, and how the old white male voices Western-centric voices are very, very dominant. Women are virtually non-existent, let alone other scholars. And it's one of the critical things that I think we need to go to, is to increase diversity and to increase inclusion and not keep practicing exclusion, is that we don't just change compositions of advisory boards or editorial boards. It's the outputs of those organisations, of those journals, of those conferences, those workshops. That's got to reflect the inclusion and diversity. It's got to be ongoing practices. So that's really where I want to go to. I don't want to repeat all the good things that Ingrid said at the outset, but I also want to highlight that I think one of the big risks that we have at the moment is because of the last 12 months and the 12 months that we will go into, is that our institutions will make it even more difficult for us, and even within our own smaller heterodox groupings, it will make it more difficult for us because of the pressure that is now being put through the higher education sector. And I believe it is as difficult in the UK, US and Europe as it is in Australia. And that means incredible pressure on our teachings, on recruitment practices, which are, in my case, non-existent. They're all on hold. And that will make it even harder for us to make progress and to maintain that progress and not fall back. So I want to highlight that, and I want to come back to that, I hope, into the Q&A. I'll leave my opening remarks there. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. It's quite exciting. I wish I'd had the opportunity when I returned to academia in 2003. So it's fabulous that it's now happening, and let's hope that we can do this on an ongoing basis. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Lynn, for that. Next, we have Jayati Ghosh. Jayati is a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She serves on the board of directors of the International Association for Feminist Economics and the editorial board of Feminist Economics. And she is also the executive secretary of the International Development Economics Associates. She holds a PhD in economics from the University of Cambridge. She has authored and or edited 19 books and nearly 200 scholarly articles, and has received several prizes for her work. She has advised governments in India and other countries, consulted for major international organizations, and is a member of several international commissions. Her research interests include globalization, international trade and finance, employment patterns, macroeconomic policy, gender issues, poverty, and inequality. She is also the advisory board member of Econ. Jayati, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. And it's a real pleasure to be in this panel, but I have to say, most of all, it's a real pleasure that you exist. You know, I'm really very, very happy that a bunch of young, feisty economists is actually taking up this challenge, and it was obviously overdue, and I'm very, very happy to be helping in any way I can in this endeavor. Hannah mentioned IDEAS, International Development Economics Associates. I just want to give a little background on that and why we set that up, because I think that is still absolutely valid, and the very fact that DECON has got particular issues on the agenda points to how, unfortunately, we were not able to make very much of a dent, although I hope we still can. IDEAS was set up to confront what we broadly could call the North Atlantic dominance of the discipline, specifically development economics, but broadly economics. And it's a North Atlantic dominance in the sense that it's not just that scholarship, analysis, understanding of the global South is ignored. It's ignored even by ourselves. Economists in Brazil are not aware of what's happening, you know, who's writing interesting stuff in Malaysia. Economists in India have no idea of the excellent work happening in Senegal, and so on and so forth. And if we do, it's all mediated by conferences and journals that come out of the North Atlantic. And it was really that which we hoped to confront, and we wanted to bring much more direct interaction amongst the global south. I think that's important because I think this issue is still very, very, it's very evident, right? We all know that economics, just like everything else, reflects all these power structures nationally, globally, and of course they represent the social patterns of discrimination and hierarchy as well. But I think there are many things which are pushing both researchers and teachers into specific directions which reinforce that North Atlantic dominance. There's the whole hierarchy of publications, which has such an impact because it then determines whether you will get jobs, whether you will get tenure, whether you will be on boards, whether you will do, etc., etc. There are the resources. Global people in universities in most of the global south cannot afford, most of the time, even their libraries cannot afford access to a lot of the journals that are seen as required. But certainly they cannot afford the research money or the conference money or all of the other things that are required. The incentive structures are hugely skewed. There's much greater valuation of degrees from the North. I mean, unfortunately, I'm a beneficiary of that. I got a degree in England, in Cambridge, and therefore I was valued more than many of my colleagues who are actually were much better than me. I spent 34 years in Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. And many of my colleagues were infinitely better than me, but they didn't have that little foreign degree. I think all of these are very large and big structures, which are not easy to confront and break down. And of course, then you have all of the other issues that Lee and Lynn have already raised so well. So it's certainly the case that economics in general marginalizes those from different positions. Okay, now Lee is making me embarrassed about calling them heterodox, but different positions, non-mainstream positions are generally undervalued, ignored, marginalized. And it's only when a mainstream guy suddenly realizes the truth that everyone says, hey, that's true, okay? It takes Krugman to do a model for everyone to realize that uneven development is a problem, which frankly, in the developing world, economists have been writing about, people have been, using as a framework, etc., for a very long time. So I think all of these are inherent, not just in the mainstream. I think what you picked up on in the introduction, Ingrid, and I think it's so true, is that this is also true in the world of non-mainstream. We have to now find another word, Lee, you have to help us. So it's true in the non-mainstream as well. Let's face it, which are the big non-mainstream journals? They all come out of the North Atlantic. Which are the, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I can think of really excellent articles written by people I know in the Global South, which now that I'm here in Amherst, I realize nobody here knows about. I can think of excellent researchers who have done very profound work in different areas of political economy. And we don't know each other, but the North definitely doesn't know us. And until the North knows us, we will not know each other. It's still the case, unfortunately. I think all of that is very true. I think when I'm looking at the lack of diversity, if I had to identify as a ranking, hierarchy, the problem of approach would be fundamental, the most important. The fact that non-mainstream, non-classical approaches are consistently marginalized, ignored, and with that, political economy, history, economic philosophy, all of those things are pushed aside. That's the number one problem. But I think the problem of location might well be number two. I would put that ahead of the gender bias, of the other forms of discrimination. I really think the problem of location is all pervasive, even among feminist economists, even among economists who look at race, who look at other aspects of inequality. That reflects the deeper structural issues of, as I mentioned, resources, hierarchy, incentive structures that occur in the global discipline. It's a very big task to fight this. I think it's amazing that you're getting together to fight it. And I completely agree with Lynn's point that the only way to do it is proactively engaging all the time. Those of you who are out there researching, please make sure you are looking for people who have written on this elsewhere, not just in the Northern Academy. Please, when you are thinking of readings for your course, extend yourself, make an effort to see who has written about this elsewhere. It's not so difficult nowadays, in fact, with the globe. It doesn't happen enough, including in the non-mainstream. And I think that is one of the areas I would really like to push for. Okay, thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Now we would have a contribution from Sabella Jane Dlovu. Unfortunately, due to health issues, Sabella wasn't able to join us today in the end, and he extends his sincere apologies for not being able to be here. However, he has prepared a short statement on the topic, which will be shortly read out by Ingrid. But before that, I just also wanted to introduce Sabella, since his contribution will be presented indirectly. Sabella is a professor and chair of epistemologies of the Global South at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Bayreuth in Germany. He previously worked as research professor and director of scholarship in the Department of Leadership and Transformation in the Principal and Vice Chancellor's Office at the University of South Africa. He holds a PhD in modern African history from the University of Zimbabwe and has also published extensively with over 47 peer-reviewed articles, 45 book chapters, and 8 books. His work centers on coloniality, imperialism, decolonization, and African subjectivity identities. And he is also the advisory board member of DECOM. Ingrid, over to you.
Thank you. It's a real shame he can't be here. I won't be able to, do justice to the way he would present it, but his points are really good and very provocative. So we've thought it was really important to make sure that they're included in this roundtable so that the other panelists and the audience can engage with them as well. And it's quite short, and he also has some good action points as well. So I'll read it out now. So the focus on diversity and inclusivity in economics is itself an obstacle. The pluralist turn is itself predicated on opening economics to various schools of thought. This amounts to intellectual tolerance more than anything. What is needed is for heterodox economics to liberate itself from the idea of the economic as a domain that is of primary importance in human life. What is needed is a shift from the pluralist turn to a decolonial turn. The decolonial turn seeks to go into the roots of the birth of economics as a field of study and a central part of human life. The decolonial turn is reflected in the work of Samara Min, who rebelled against the discipline of economics, arguing that it was a discipline for equilibrium, that is, for capitalist status quo. Listen to Amin's critique. And then he quotes, "The only possible science is science of society. For social reality is one. It is never economic or political or ideological. The conceptual equipment of this pure economic history is situated at the level of abstraction that makes it useless for analysis, the working of mechanisms, even the economic mechanisms of any society whatsoever." End quote. This critique comes from someone who attained a PhD in economics in Paris in France. The obstacle that emerges is that of economic thought, economic theory, and indeed the discipline of economics itself. The elephant at the center is its bourgeois origin. Bourgeois pontification has always been partial and misleading, as it always needed to mask exploitation and naturalize inequalities. This is why one of the founding fathers of economics, Adam Smith, introduced the dangerous notion of the invisible hand as part of the hiding the locus of enunciation of economics. This is why Gilbert Rist had this to say, quote, "Economic science has nothing scientific. It is no more than a battle of opinions, which fluctuate according to the conjuncture in ways that enable the strongest to impose their will. Ultimately, the belief in development rests upon the credence given to economics. Neither can be shaken off unless the other is shaken off too." This bourgeois trickery is well captured by Catherine Odora Hoppers and Howard Richards. Thinking is calculating, calculating is economics, economics is development. This is its seduction. sell yourself, they utter night and day, buzzing with their mercantile message from air to air, like bees seeking not honey in flowers, but salt in wounds. That was a quote. And then he quotes again, this reality is captured by Maria Lugones. The cognitive needs of capitalism include measurement, quantification, externalization, or objectification of what is knowable with respect to the knower, so as to control the relations among people and nature and among them with respect to it, in particular the property and means of production. This way of knowing was imposed on the whole capitalist world as the only valid and rationality as emblematic of modernity. So then there's a change of pace and he says, what is to be done? And he has 8 bullet points. So first of all, heterodox economics must liberate itself from the fiction of economics in the first instance, and not satisfy itself with pluralization of mythical bourgeois trickery that conceals rather than reveals how the world works in general and how capitalism works in particular. Second, heterodox economics must be an interdisciplinary field rather than remaining hostage to the idea of the economic, so as to deal with real problems facing humanity. Third, heterodox economics has to be predicated on thinking across traditions rather than diverse schools of economics. Fourth, heterodox economics must also liberate itself from the ghost of Karl Marx, who provided a good science of understanding capitalism, but also remaining hostage to market-determined identities as the only valid human identities. And then heterodox economics must draw insights from the impact of the current COVID-19 pandemic to lay a foundation for economics of care, rather than pursuit of profits and consumerism. Heterodox economics must fully embrace decoloniality if it is to move beyond myths of markets and embrace diverse ways through which various people live and envision life beyond capitalism. And finally, the immediate task for heterodox economics is to shift the paradigm on capitalism from its Eurocentric articulation to its understanding from the Global South, which has a rich tradition and history of resisting capitalism, not as an economic system, but as a civilization. Thank you. So that was from Sibella.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And thank you to Sibella as well for providing these really thought-provoking points. Now, last but not least, we have Linwood Tauhid. Linwood is an associate professor and the IPhD director in economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He is the current president of the National Economic Association, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. So happy birthday to NEA. He holds a PhD from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. His research interests include institutional economics, economic methodology, African American political economy, community economic development, analysis of education, as well as system dynamics modeling. So Linwood, over to you.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to be able to be a part of this event with this distinguished panel. A couple of corrections. The NEA had just celebrated its 50th anniversary. It was founded in 1969 as the Caucus of Black Economists, and so we are 50 years old. I forget what the other point correction I wanted. Oh yes, I am no longer the IPhD advisor at UMKC. I am a graduate of UMKC. In fact, my bachelor's is in computer science, and I spent about 20 years in that field before I came back to school to become an economist. And I had no idea of economics in particular. I just attended my hometown university, right? My second hometown. I'm actually from Philadelphia. But I came into the university, and in order to get into the graduate school, I needed to take some intermediate econ courses. And in my 302 course, my microeconomics course, the professor was discussing the theory of the firm and how prices are set. And I had been an owner of my own business for about 10 years, and I knew that this was nonsense. Okay, but I continued on. I came back because I was interested in Black community economic development. I had been the president of the Black Chamber of Commerce, and had a business was doing very well, but realized that my business doing well didn't mean my community was doing well. And I wanted to figure out, how do I make a transformation? So I came back to school to study economics. I took my institutional theory course that fall, and I understood, or it was immediate apparently to me, that that the original institutionalism was going to be helpful to me in terms of what I wanted to do. And so I am an original institutionalist. That means a couple of things to me. It means that there's an understanding that no economic problem is just an economic problem. That society is complex, that multiple perspectives are necessary in order to understand any complex problem. So I, as an institutionalist, I don't adhere to an idea that any one particular way of thinking about the economy is the way of looking at the economy. I tell my students in the beginning of my institutional theory course in my syllabus that institutional economics is not the anti-neoclassical economics. And if you think about it that way, you will never understand what this is about. It's not the case that everything that's in the neoclassical spectrum is wrong. It also must be the case that not everything that was said by the literates in the institutional tradition are right, or in the Marxian, or in any other tradition. So my question is, where do we begin to get the things that are important, that we think are perhaps true, or true for the moment? And because of my moving out of community development, I believe that comes from the community, that it is the community itself that we are trying to get some understanding of for development. And I don't avoid that term, but I think it's the community that needs to move forward. And so one of the questions was about the lack of diversity among heterodox economists. And it doesn't surprise me that there's a lack of diversity in heterodoxy, because heterodox economists are part of society, and there's a lack of diversity of power in society. And so when we find that us as academics believe that we can talk among ourselves and come up with ideas that we can then go out and give to the community, as if that set of ideas are wrong, but our set of ideas are right, without confronting or without asking the community to participate, I think we are just reproducing the structure of privilege and power that's in society, even though heterodoxy has less power now. The institutionalists were fairly ascendant in the first part of the 20th century, but that went away, and the focus is on financial capitalism rising away from industrial capitalism. I mean, there are all kinds of theoretical ways of thinking about it, but the community, the people out there who are where we come from, they want, they may want something other than just a very pithy discourse on the nature of capitalism and the nature of oppression and so forth and so on. They're concerned about their families. They're concerned about how they live their lives. And I think until heterodoxy and heterodox practitioners begin to take more direction and more understanding and listening to, quote, ordinary people, and I don't like to use that term, but ordinary people, then we will simply be in an echo chamber, in a room where we talk and debate among ourselves. And the process means that we are doing what Deidre McCluskey calls blackboard economics. Even though we're not writing equations, we're still doing having these discussions at conferences, and we're not reaching out into the real world to figure out how we improve the lives of people, right? That's certainly the reason I came to economics as a late academic. But I'm always aware, at least I hope I'm always aware, that those who are not academics have something to tell us and something that we can learn from. As an example, some years ago, UMKC, we used to have a summer school, institutionalist and post-Keynesian summer school every summer. And I would inevitably get into a debate with students. At one time, I was a student in that process, talking about whether or not Hispanic labor, immigrant labor coming from the South into the US was causing a disturbance in the labor market that was affecting low-income African-American workers, and particularly workers who were high school dropout. Now, there had been some research on this, and I brought this issue up. The response was always from the mostly white male, but also female students. Oh, we'll take care of that after the revolution. That once the revolution occurs, then racism will disappear. That's not something that I believe. It doesn't seem to me apparent that will happen. And also, my response to them was, this great revolution that we are trying to or wanting to bring forward is not going to happen unless you can convince African Americans and Latinx persons and other persons who are receiving or on the receiving end of the inequality, that they should join your revolution. This is not something that will be led from by the academic, by the vanguards. It's something that you have to have the ordinary, the common people as a part of. And so we can talk to each other a lot, but we need to talk to ordinary people. We need to find out what their aspirations are, how they view the world. And until we do that, we are simply going to replicate within heterodoxy the problems of society in general.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Linwood, Jayati, Lee, and Lynn, for your amazing contributions. And we are certainly looking to hear more as we progress with our Q&A. So just as a reminder to our attendees, you can type your questions in the Q&A box. When you write them, please specify whether you would like the question to be answered by any specific panelists. Otherwise, we will assume that all panelists can contribute to the answer. Yeah, with that, I would like to kickstart the Q&A by asking the first question. And the question is actually inspired by Lynn's contribution earlier. And as touched upon by Lynn, my question to all of the panelists is the following. Do you see any specific challenges with regards to diversifying and decolonizing economics due to the pandemic, and how we can tackle these? So perhaps, Lynn, if you would like to go first, I will welcome you to start, and then we're going to go through the rest of our panelists.
Thank you, Hannah. I think for all the reasons that have already been outlined, if we went sort of pre-pandemic and we understood the situation we're in and what needed to be done, but now we go into a pandemic situation and it's a new environment, and particularly in the academy and the pressure on the higher university, higher education sector. What I see is it's like divide and conquer. And I'll give you a micro example. Less international students, less fees from international students, so jobs are lost. And that reduces then the teachings and curriculum. And what happens when that occurs is everyone goes back to what they were previously doing. They're not reviewing, e.g. reading lists, they're not decolonising reading lists, they're not opening up. There's also extra pressure on teaching loads, there's less people and there's no new recruitment. So then there's less opportunity for not just diversity or inclusion, but to open up and make it a lot wider. It also means people, I think, become more inward looking. And that's where I want to go to Lynwood's point about participation. It's all very well being in the academy, but if our research is going to be relevant and the difficult conversations we have with our students and opening up and including greater voices, more voices, our research won't be relevant, and it doesn't really matter what we do in the academy unless we're actually not just engaged, but the community participates with us. I've just seen Lee's dog and I've got two outside my door that are banging on it. It is about, it's not just about engagement with the community, but if we're actually going to come up with solutions and policies that reflect the community's needs, but also reflect a non-Eurocentric or non-Western centric view, we need those voices that have been excluded to be part of those conversations. And that's why I go to that more difficult thing of going outside of the academy and doing something of real world relevance. But it's not about prescribing to a group like in the South of what needs to be done. It's about the South being part of the conversation. And I think this is made more difficult by the pressure now, the institutional pressures that are being imposed because of the pandemic. I can go to a whole lot of other things as well that will actually, I think, constrain our ability to increase diversity, to include more identities. And it's things in terms of how our work structures have changed because of the pandemic. I am not allowed to give lectures, to do large scale lectures. I must do all of those online with online recordings. I can do some small face-to-face classes, but that means I engage with 15 students, not 400. Similarly, engagement with colleagues. So there's a whole range of things that normally we would have available to us that we could work with. But I think now, because of the situation we're in the higher education sector, because of COVID-19, is we're now going to be more constrained than previously before. So I think we've got to rethink what strategies we can use. And I'm not just talking about social media, because I think that's like a one-hit wonder and people move on. It's about sustaining change. And I think we've got to rethink how we do that. And it might be, going to Lynwood's point about communities, it might be about more of that community participation rather than just engagement. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. Perhaps now I would like to ask Lee Badgett to provide her answer.
Well, I don't think I could be less bleak than the picture that Lynn just pointed out. But I think I guess I will just say that I have looked at this mostly so far from the perspective of my own students, and it's very clear that the toll that's being taken is going to disproportionately hit people who are already vulnerable. We know that in terms of the epidemiology of the epidemic, and I see it in my students. So it has a direct effect on diversity. So caregivers, who are disproportionately going to be women, are facing a double bind, triple bind even in some cases. Students who are already facing other kinds of social marginalizations. We know of the existence of health disparities, and those health disparities are likely to be exacerbated even if they don't get COVID, but mental health in particular are some of those challenges I've seen in students. So I think that's, that's going to take its toll. I think we've got a lot of students in our program who are in a holding pattern, who maybe could have been finished with a dissertation by now, but are waiting to see what happens with the job market. So I think it's hard to know kind of how much that will make a difference. I will say the strategies that we've been using locally have been to rely on our union. We have a very strong faculty union at UMass Amherst, and they have been successful in in getting some kind of compensation for the extra workload that we've all had to bear. We've been successful in connecting with the other unions on campus for the staff who have disproportionately borne the brunt of the financial situation at our university. So I think those kinds of solidarity, organizing, these are ways that we can push back and try to make things, keep things from getting worse. I would say, I think that the other thing is that we've recognized that maybe, and this, who wants to talk about a silver lining, but let's at least say that there are some things that this, I think, has made us realize that it is possible to be connected to people globally in ways that we were just never got around to doing. So like having seminar series, for example, that can involve people who are in places that have a good enough, kind of internet connection that they can connect. That's obviously not everybody, but it does mean that we can have audiences that are global, that we can have speakers who are global. So it takes away some of the some of the challenges that we face if we want to fly in a speaker from a long way away, and that's not possible financially. So I think, I think that maybe there are a few things that we've learned from this that will actually help us going forward to diversify. But mostly it's going to make it harder on the people who are in our profession or trying to become parts of our profession.
Excellent, thank you. Jayati?
Yeah, I'm going to have to agree with Lee on this. Unfortunately, it's mostly bad news. It's mostly really, really bad news. And it particularly in developing countries, the resource cut is massive. I mean, we're talking about sometimes some universities getting half, the public universities getting half of what they were getting before, which means large-scale layoff, it means large-scale lack of recruitment. It means cutting down on library and other access, all kinds of things. So I think the worst thing is that, especially for young people, there is a real difficulty. I mean, a real lack of, shall we say, just economic viability in doing anything. And of course, therefore, the pressures on young people in particular, those who don't yet have jobs or have jobs that are not secure, to conform to the mainstream and to the existing power structures is immense. So that's number one concern. And the second large concern relates to that. I think I kind of mentioned it earlier that, since the resources are so structured in a particular way, a lot of research is then determined by who has the money to do it. And again, it's typically the global north. And then it's in the areas of economic development, it's certain kinds of research. So let's say RCTs are the flavor of the month or the year. And RCTs get lots of money, ironically, not just from the North, but from governments in developing countries who are persuaded that this is the way in which they can test our policy and so on. The agenda, the methodology, the questions are all set out by researchers in the global North, and then people in the South who are the collaborators are really just the intellectual coolies of the project. You know, they kind of do the dog work, they do the work on the ground. And unfortunately, it's likely that a lot of that will also get reinforced by the further lack of resources that is coming about because of the pandemic, that has already come about because of the pandemic. Okay, so that's the bad news. Is there any good news at all? Yes, I think, yes, there is. I mean, the very fact that we're having this panel, that your group is actually quite a global group, that you're attracting, from what I hear, more people from different parts of the world, and you're able to interact with them in a kind of, relatively flat way, which would not have happened because we wouldn't have all thought of just doing it entirely online. And therefore, the ones who could get together would always be at an advantage. So there is something a little bit flattening, not always, because there are huge connectivity problems in the developing world, but there's a little bit more flattening. There's a little bit, as Lee was saying, a little bit more tendency to search out for people in different locations and try and engage with them, learn from them, interact. And I think that's happening more and more across a range of people who are interested in pluralist economics. So that's a positive, and that's something that we won't have to lose even when the pandemic is over. We'd have to think of creative ways of engaging beyond just the face-to-face, which necessarily privileges those who have more resources. So yeah, I think that's a positive. I also think that when we're talking about relating to the outside world and outside society and so on, economics and mainstream economics really has a very bad name now, for obvious reasons, among ordinary people. And ultimately, economics itself responds to power. So if you can get enough ordinary people out there saying there is a different way of understanding this, which there are economists who are telling me that there's a different way of understanding this, you might actually get a push to change the discipline itself.
Excellent, thank you. Linwood, over to you.
Yes. Roy Bhaskar wrote that crisis illuminates social structure. And so we see this house of cards that was made to look like a gleaming building. We see now that there are many missing pieces. In the US with the Trump administration, creating a crisis in government. There's a constitutional crisis every other day. We begin to see the fact that glorious document that was created by the founding fathers with balance of powers and so forth and so on is just not so, right? It appears to me that one of the three branches of government, the executive branch, which controls the army and the law enforcement agency, the Justice Department, can simply say to the other parts, I don't want to do what you tell me to do. I'll do what I want to do. That's a crisis, but it's not like it wasn't there before. What the U.S. was really about was a gentleman's agreement, an agreement between the wealthy, who happened to be white men in its founding. And as long as they all agreed to keep the structure hidden, everything was okay. And so the crisis of not just COVID, I mean, COVID is more of a crisis because of the incompetence of government. But we see the structure being illuminated, and it's illuminated not just to academics, again, to use that theme, but to the general public, right? Naomi Klein, in a number of cases, indicated that crisis creates an opportunity, that there are those who will take advantage of any type of crisis. COVID is certainly one of those. And if there's no crisis apparent, then the thing is to create one so that you can then come in and be the savior and take advantage of the situation. I think there's a quote that's attributed to either Rahm Emanuel or Winston Churchill. I don't know about those differences, but it says, never let a crisis go to waste. And so, we find, for example, that small businesses in some cities, 70% of small businesses are closed and probably will not be able to reopen. And it won't be necessarily because when the crisis is over, we're not going to go back and buy things, but major corporations, major restaurant chains and so forth will bought up all of the franchises and opportunities. And so we'll see a consolidation of power, and small businesses will not have an opportunity to come back. We've talked about the crisis at the university level, and many universities are consolidating, ostensibly over lack of funds. I'm not so sure that that's always the reason, but it's the reason that's given because it's a good reason to say that we can't continue to hire or to keep on faculty certain persons or certain members of the faculty. And so we run this process as a business. And when a crisis, business can be very good for some and very bad for others. So there's that reflection of society in the university. And in this crisis, or every crisis, there's this ratcheting up that occurs with those who have more and more power getting more and more power. And again, going back to a theme, I don't believe that we can reverse that course without community. Academics, we cannot, if we're going to be dismal about the dismal science, talking is not going to work. It's not going to do it. There were some discussion about general strike, and if various things were not going to be done in the U.S., I don't know about the rest of the world, but general strike participated in by labor unions and others. If the administration was not going to come to the aid and have various care packages or relief packages and so forth, I'm not so sure that we will not be seeing that kind of desperation. And that is desperation. To go on a general strike is a desperate thing. It means that people are going to agree to forego their current income in the hopes that the mass solidarity will lead to better things later on. That's a desperation situation, and I hope we don't get there, but I'm not convinced that we won't.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. I'm very pleased to say that we have had quite a lot of engagement from our attendees. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read out the questions posed in groups of 3, so that we can hear as many questions and comments as possible from our attendees. And then please feel free to address them in any way you see fitting. So the first question was asked by Caroline Hussein, who says the following. I remember Professor Fantucheru sharing some of these views like Professor Ghosh. While I can see geography ignoring certain scholars, many of us born and bred in the global north, e.g. Black women, are not being cited anywhere on this planet. My question, how can racial capitalism theory, Cedric Robinson, contribute to #heterodox economics? So that was the question by Caroline. Then the following question was asked by Deb Figard. And Deb is saying, Do you think that the trend toward a two-tiered labor market with non-tenure track positions, teaching-only positions, temporary contracts, adjunct positions, online-only teaching, will make the elitism in academia and the economics profession worse? What structural changes do we need to make in our journals, our professional meetings, our culture, and other institutions to respond to these overall trends in the academy, our discipline to decolonize it? And then last but not least in this round of questions is Ellen Mutari. And Ellen is asking the following. I'm frustrated by the way heterodox economists continue to use concepts such as class without recognizing how these concepts are gendered, racialized, and reflect colonial perspectives. Are there any other examples that the panelists would like to mention? So these are our first three questions, and perhaps now I will ask Jayati to go first so that everyone has a chance to kickstart the round of questions. So Jayati, please go ahead.
Oh my God, these are very tough questions. So yeah, okay, let me begin with the second question. You know, absolutely, we have so much hierarchy and discrimination, and I won't even call it a two-tiered labor market. It's multi-tiered. You know, there are those who have secure jobs, there are those who have contract jobs, then there are those who have those ad hoc jobs, then there are those who are like guest lecturers that get only paid for those specific lectures or courses, and that can continue for 20, 30 years. And I think this is true pretty much across the world because neoliberalism has destroyed the academy as we know it and higher education across the world for several decades now. So yes, there is this tremendous hierarchy. How do we confront it? Well, ideally by demanding proper, regular jobs for everyone, you know, I personally am not in favor of, you know, there's a lot, I find that even a lot of non-mainstream economists tend to believe that there should be a hierarchy because of the whole idea of, you know, merit, quality, and etc., that you should have some hierarchies in higher education. I think all the hierarchies are counterproductive because they fundamentally deny diversity in many ways. How do we change that? Well, obviously we have to keep fighting for it. I think, you know, Lee mentioned unions, and I think that's a very important thing. I don't know how many senior professors across academia are active members of unions. It's relatively rare. Maybe we should all, you know, make sure that that happens as much as possible. I know in my own former university, that was a critical role played by the union, the teachers union, and it was essential that senior professors were part of it, an active part of it, and played an important role in it, because, you know, to put the burden on younger faculty and younger economists who have much more to lose is really not fair. On the issue of class versus other categories, you know, this is such a complex issue, and it's something I think I personally grapple with all the time. In India, we had caste, which is a very, very big divide, and it's probably, you know, equivalent to race, but more complex. And because it's not immediately visible, it's also more, it plays out in many different ways, but it is as damaging and as all immersive. How do we confront that? I suppose we definitely have to be always conscious of it, but, you know, it's not just enough to be conscious of it. I think there is a real need to, for those of us who have had more privileged positions for whatever reason, to actively search for knowledge among different categories of people who are, you know, analysts, economists, social scientists. We tend not to do enough of that. I am being self-critical here. I think, you know, I've talked about how the North decides about what goes on in research agenda and what is knowledge production and what is worth being considered as knowledge, etc. But we do that, we reproduce that in our own little ecosystems as well. And I think it's very important to be conscious of that and to look for where we can gain knowledge in different ways and then disseminate that as much as we can. Again, something that perhaps is not done enough. Now I've forgotten the first question. Let me just have a quick look. It was Caroline, right? And Caroline's question was that racial capitalism. Yes, definitely. Yes, yes, absolutely. I completely agree. I would bring in other forms of stratification. In India, as I mentioned, caste is very big. In other countries, perhaps you have other different ethnic and other forms of stratification. I think the point to remember is that capitalism plays out in different ways and it doesn't follow that standard pattern. And it will draw, it's like an octopus, right? It grabs whatever is available in society to make use of it in every possible way. And so as economists, we must be aware that it is operating within particular social constructs and then changing those social constructs. And I think racial capitalism is one way of looking at it. And in different contexts, you will have other ways. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. Perhaps now Linwood, if you could go next.
Yeah, I think these are very, very difficult questions, made difficult by the fact that there's so much interconnection between all of these things. For example, the question about class being gendered and racialized and colonial. What that says to me is that the concept of class is not just some simple independent thing, that it is self-complex. And I don't generally have a problem with using concepts if I know what they mean. And so, you know, these are words. These are concepts, and all concepts get their meaning from their connection to other concepts. And if there is a elucidation of the term class by connecting it to gender or race, if it helps us to understand it better, then I think it becomes a valid way of thinking about it. But ultimately, we can't think about everything at the same time. And so it's like, you know, every word in the dictionary is connected to every other word. I mean, you know, words in the dictionary are defined by other words and so forth. There's a connection of meaning. And to take one word and separate it from all other words is just not a possible thing to do. So all concepts are going to have connections to other concepts. I think we need to get used to the complexity with understanding that someone else's way of thinking about the term class is not right or wrong. It is their way of thinking about that word class. And unless they are using the word class in a diametrically opposite way that we're using the word class, we should be able to think about what that contributes to our understanding, and hopefully they'll think about that as well. I agree. I don't like the word pluralism because it's kind of a word of tolerance. That you know, I'll take my point of view, and you know, I won't criticize your point of view so much. But you know, all of these words and all of these constructs are models about how we think the world works, and all models are wrong. And so I don't have a problem with the use of the word class or any other term, as long as I can define it or someone else can define it. And we stick to our definitions as we go through our discussions, that we don't shift the ground on each other so that we don't know what we're talking about. I think that's the only question that I'll want to answer here.
Thank you, Linwood. Now I'd ask Lee and then Lynn.
It's a great set of questions. I think Caroline's question about you know, who gets cited basically, and which of these frameworks get pulled in as part of the things we want to make sure are part of the conversation, makes me think about how many times I've kind of found things that seemed so relevant, like when I was a grad student in particular, found things that seemed so relevant to what I was studying, and yet people had sort of dropped them, and often they were things that were written by people of color in the US, writing about racial issues, for example. So I think, I think there's a level that we have to hold ourselves to if we are scholars and intellectuals and drawing on the range of ideas. We have an obligation to look broadly about things that we're studying, and that is an obligation that should be reinforced at lots of different levels. When we send papers into journals, we often get back feedback saying, oh, you forgot to cite this particular article, or, what about this other body of research? But we need editors who are going to push us to do that. That is a responsibility of journals and editors and of each other to kind of make sure that we are being inclusive of all the ideas that are out there. Our work will be better for it. So it is something that we should all be doing. So in a lot of ways, it's sort of a similar question to me anyway, in terms of thinking about, class being, sort of looked at from the perspective of racial differences or gender differences. Again, it's like, how can I say this in a way that I won't get in trouble later? I mean, we care about class. We might study class, or we might study gender, but we're really also trying to use those as tools, as lenses to understand something that's happening underneath that. And if those things are happening and influencing wages, for example, or occupational positions people end up in, then we need to know we need to at least be thinking about all of those. And it has to be more than a checklist, which is kind of what intersectionality sometimes becomes. It's a checklist. Have we thought about sexuality? Have we thought about gender? Have we thought about race? But to have it mean something, we have to go a lot deeper. And I think often we're missing those opportunities. So I would like to see us do that more. The last thing I'll just say is I think on the two-tier question, of course, it's going to make a big difference. There's, it's tremendously damaging to, to our sense to my sense of equity in terms of, this two-tiered structure that's being created. But there are many things that I think we could do to ameliorate it to some extent. Our union, just as another example, has tried to make it much more costly to hire lecturers where they are part of our bargaining unit. We have interdependent utility functions now, in a sense. And we will all, be better off the better off their professional lives are. We can better value the teaching component of the work that they may be doing more of than we are. And maybe that's something that journals can take into account. As researchers, we can collaborate with folks who are time constrained because they're doing a lot of the work that we might otherwise be asked to do. We could invite them to be part of research collaborations that will help them do some of the work that they enjoy doing and find meaningful, and also perhaps be good for them in their careers over the longer haul. So I think there are things that we can do if we if we kind of think about it and don't see them as being this other group of people that we might see at faculty meetings or might not. Are they even part of our decision-making processes or not? Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. So I do think there's a lot more we can do to try to even things out, at least to some extent, if not completely.
Thank you. Lynn?
Thanks, Hannah. I'll just work backwards. I'll start with Alan's question first. Look, I agree with Lynn, when incredibly complex, but I like to advocate quite strongly that we render quite explicitly how we are conceptualizing the concepts that we use, e.g. class, gender, etc. And this is where I think too often, we don't make it explicit. We rely on implicit conceptualizations of others. So then we start to overlook how appropriate or not these concepts are that we use. I've moved away from using class per se, but think more about households, which in lots of senses for me are much more relevant than thinking about class per se. I also think about rethinking the concept of what is a family, what is a community, and how that may be reflected in particular ways. So I think, one, I'd render definitions or conceptualizations much more explicit if we are going to use concepts like class, but I think we've got to rethink other concepts that we blithely might toss around, like the household, like family, like community, what we actually mean by those as well. And in some respects, and as I mentioned this because it's more relevant, I suppose, for my energy research, if we're going to use concepts to explain reality, we've got to think about what they mean in concrete terms in a contemporary sense. That's why I go to community, that's why I go to families, that's why I go to households. Going to Deb's question, and I'll pick up partly an answer to Carolyn's question here. Yeah, I think it will make elitism in the academy much stronger. But I think there's a couple of things in here that we can push back on, we can resist, and we can support. And I go to things like the teaching only positions or the non-tenure track positions. These are becoming more prevalent, as well as temporary contract positions. That's where, and I noticed Ingrid made the point in her opening remarks about mentoring, but I think there is a role for mentoring here for people that are engaged in these positions, teaching only positions. We use the expression here in Australia quite a bit. It sort of sucks the oxygen out of doing anything else, which reduces your chances of getting a more permanent ongoing position or being able to do research to establish a reputation, to get more secure employment. So I think there can be mentoring to support people that occupy these positions because they've got no choice. That's all that's been made available to them. I'm uncomfortable about adjunct positions becoming forms of unpaid labour. So I think adjunct positions we can support in particular ways, but not just use them as unpaid labour. But again, they could be used in ways to mentor junior colleagues, also to assist research students, but not as a source of unpaid labour. And I'm comfortable about the online teaching because basically I think it's privatised a lot of the costs of employers, university employers, by transferring it onto the individual and restructuring the arrangements by which we engage with our students. But I might come back to that a little bit later because I don't want to take up too much time. So in answer to Deb's first question, I think it will make elitism in the academy worse, but I think we can push back a little bit and support those that are engaged in these positions. The structural changes, this to me is really, really important in terms of journals, professional meetings, culture, other institutions. It's not just about increasing diversity on editorial boards or having a nice statement about diversity in editorial policies. It's actually the collection of articles in a journal should reflect our community and the diversity that we wish to see. And I go to three examples, or one example of a journal in Australia, the Journal of Australian Political Economy. It's published a number of special theme issues over recent years on heterodox economics, what's wrong with economics, on the pandemic. And what happens is the old white males are invited to contribute. And we end up with a situation where, for example, the issue on heterodox economics a few years ago, 74% were male, and all the women represented were co-authors. A few years later, an issue on what's wrong with economics, 88% male. 2 female authors and only one was a sole author. More recent issue on the pandemic, 70% male, and of the 11 women, only 4 were sole authors. These were deliberate decisions by the guest editors of these special issues, and I think it's got to change. I think what we need to reflect in our journals, in our conferences, in our workshops, is we mandate diversity. We've got to practice diversity, not just give it lip service, and I think we can make some of these structural changes. But going back to publications and the practice of publications, it's not just editors, it's this constant, as authors, as scholars, we should be thinking about, yes, drawing on a much wider body of work to reflect the diversity that we actually want to see in our in economics and across our practices. So it's not just relying on editors to say, well, you haven't cited that body of work. It's about us as scholars also searching it out and not just citing the same old, same old. And this is why we have such a problem with all those awful rankings with heterodox journals. But I think there are a number of structural changes we can make to our professional meetings, our conferences, our workshops, even in our teachings, that can reflect that practice of diversity, which actually goes into me a quite practical way of inclusion. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. We have a few more questions, and we're going to ask them in 2 rounds of 3. And I think this is probably going to be all that we will have time for today. So the next comment is from Marcella Corsi. She says the following: I have problems with the term Eurocentrism. We should not confuse West and/or Europe with English-speaking countries, UK and US. What about diversity in languages? What about the obligation of using English as colonial language? We should recognize diversities also among Western countries and take advantage of them. Then the following question is by Scott Carter, who asks the following: can we have a discussion about the role of the public intellectual, especially in our local communities? Perhaps rethinking how we envision that, especially among heterodoxers, can speak to the important role of practice, as Lynn says, and having a basis in the community, as Linwood says. And then lastly, in this round of questions, a question by Randy Elbelda. Are other social sciences doing better than economics, i.e. any lessons? Students interested in understanding inequality, at least in the US, are certainly not flocking to economics, even though alternative non-mainstream economic approaches are pretty good, or at least better, at tackling these questions. So here are our 3 questions, and this time I would like to start with Linwood. So Linwood, if you could please go first.
Okay, for Marcella's question on Eurocentrism, I don't know that I understand the question. Eurocentrism, if it means that persons of European origin, whatever that geography is, are in a position to make their thoughts and ideas and priorities the priorities for the rest of the world, or they at least think they should be the priorities of the rest of the world. I don't have a problem with the term, because at least it appears that that is the case. Now, there was a time when, let's say, the country of Italy and the ethnic the residents of that country were not considered to be part of the white race by whites. I mean, it's a political term, and persons get to have membership in that. But because they were Europeans, it was easier for them to gain entry into that. When we start getting outside of that geography, it becomes more difficult for persons to become honorary Europeans, if we want to use that term. So I don't have a problem with concepts as long as they're well defined and then flexible enough to use, so that we might redefine them if we need to. But at all times we know what they are. And so the fact that the UK and the US are English speakers doesn't mean that I should think about the French and the Spanish in a different way. I mean, there are reasons to think of them in different ways, but the term Eurocentric, I think, applies to the way that that citizens of those countries position and are positioning themselves with regard to others. Now there's a nuance there, is that in any of these countries, and not just European countries, elites get to position themselves in a way that the rest of the population don't. And so when we use the term Eurocentrism, we may be just simply talking about the way that the elites in the US or UK or France or Spain think about the rest of the world, because they also think about the poor who are in Europe in many of the same ways. So there's that complexity there. So I'll stop it there.
Thank you. Lee, could you please go next?
Sure. Yeah, I guess I would like to speak to Scott's question about the public intellectual side of things. I wrote a book that came out a few years ago called The Public Professor: How to Use Your Research to Change the World, which I meant as an aspiration for a lot of us. I think that is the work that we came to economics to do, is not to just write for each other, but to do things that will have meaning in the world. And I think it's possible to do that. And that was my argument in that book. And I think a lot of it has to do with, kind of seeing the big picture of a particular issue or a debate. So we know, where can we play a useful role? That role might be working with community groups or helping to build a community group. It might be working with policymakers. It might be writing for a newspaper. There are lots of different ways that we can have a voice that has some meaning and might actually be influential in moving the world in the direction we'd like to see it go. Networking more broadly, so we're not just talking to each other, that we know who the other people who are part of that conversation, part of that decision-making process are, and we get to know them, and we build relationships with them. And then finally, that we become better communicators than we are. We have our own language when we talk to each other, even in English, economies, or whatever you want to call it. Our jargon is not something that is accessible to most people outside our field. So if we're going to go have conversations, we need to have it, have it in a language that makes sense to other people. So I think there are lots of ways that we could do a better job of being engaged with our communities and being involved in public discussions. And I would love to see more people trying to do that in economics and on the, let's call it, radical / diverse / heterodox side of the line.
Thank you. Lynn, would you like to go next?
Thanks, Hannah. Let me just go to Randy's question first about, are other social sciences doing better than economics? I'm not sure about the US or Europe, but the social sciences in Australia have enrolments of students in social sciences has rapidly changed in recent years. It's dropped considerably. And we've also had recent changes to higher education fee structures, which will make it even more difficult for students to enrol in the social sciences. Having said that, though, I'd suggest that there's a lot more interest in anthropology and sociology than in economics in a relative sense in recent years. So I think sociology and anthropology as two disciplines are offering something that economics is not in terms of understanding inequality or interest in understanding inequality. Going to Scott's question, and I don't want to repeat the comments I've already made, I think there is a very strong role for what you term the public intellectual, but I think of it more as a role to use insights and thoughts to contribute to a wider discussion, a wider debate, and not just policy input, also helping levels or different understandings of what's occurring, why it's occurring, and what can be done about it. And that's where I think it's not just policy inputs, but it's also in public forums, through media, through blogs, and using as many tools as we can. The one thing I would say, though, that I'm uncomfortable about that's occurred because of the pandemic, and we're all online, not everyone has the opportunity to connect online or have a very good internet connection. A lot of students, a lot of low-income families don't have that opportunity, and I think we've got to be mindful of that as we engage with our communities, the constraints under which they operate. And the question, Marcella's question about the term Eurocentrism, I think I might have used the word Eurocentric before, and I use that term to really mean a sort of myopic view around Europe, or a myopic view around, I will say, US-centric, a myopic view around thinking not outside the US, not outside Europe. I agree about the question about diversity in languages, and I think we need to start thinking more broadly what we mean by a diversity of identities, because it's not just about everyone who can speak English. We've got to acknowledge that so many diverse identities actually can speak a number of languages. So we should not just think of English. And I do agree with the term about using English as sort of colonial language. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you. And then finally, Jayati.
Well, thanks. I think a lot of it has already been said. That makes life easier for me. Just on Eurocentric, I think in economics, I'd go back to it. I really think it's the North Atlantic, by which I mean England and the US, which makes English, therefore, I mean, Marcella's absolutely to the point. Yes, there is a huge domination of the English language journals, English language research overall. And within that English language research and so on, there is and textbooks and everything, there is the domination of these two countries, as opposed to many other English publications in other parts of the world. But yes, that's so therefore I kind of agree with you that there is a large problem of the sort of the language bias of the discipline, at least in terms of its hierarchies, its power structures, the things that are counted as good journals and all of that enters. But just on that, on the other question, Randy, I'm not so sure I agree with you on this, Randy. Maybe because I'm speaking completely out of my own very minor experience of being in a department, a very pluralist economics department in India, and being lucky enough to come to one in the US. But I think the students are very interested in inequality. There's a lot of research on inequality. A lot of the, not just the research students, but generally there's a lot of interest. So it's not that within economics, you cannot have students being attracted to looking at inequality or being concerned about it and coming to it. It's just that there isn't enough of it, that not enough departments, teaching and research departments make that a very important part of the agenda. And I think that's the problem. So I think the solution to that one is just, may our tribe increase, actually.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So now we're going to go into our final round of questions. And since we have around 12 minutes left. This will be the final opportunity for you as well to mention any closing thoughts that you may have on the debate so far. But of course, firstly, the questions. So the first question in this round has been asked by Barbara Hopkins, who asks the following. How is this project affected by the authoritarian shift globally? Then we have a question by Howard Stein, who asks, there was considerable optimism that the 2008 Great Recession would shed light on the weaknesses of mainstream economics and open up the profession to greater diversity, yet little changed. The incentives and power structures seem to be largely intact. What was missed? What lessons can be learned to use this moment of crisis more effectively? And then the final question by Ramya Vijaya, who asks, economists, even heterodox economists, rarely make positionality statements or reflect on our positionality. This perpetuates the notion as being above and separate from the communities and issues we study. Perhaps this should be encouraged more. Think about our own positionality within communities and within our profession. So these are the final three questions. And since this is our final round, I suggest that we go in the original order. So first we start with Lee. Thank you.
Oh, I was thinking I'd have a little time to think about these questions. These are all big. I will say, just to kind of pull different pieces from these, I will say I'm not really sure about what the best strategy is to change our profession. There may be certain times when we can achieve certain kinds of aspects of change and others that are going to be harder. I think right now we are at a moment where, well, actually, no. Maybe this is what I want to say about this. I think we will be able to change our profession when the world is changing in the same direction that we want it to go. And right now, if we think about where those opportunities are, I think they are related to diversity and inclusion. I think they are, in the United States, they are really strongly related to thinking about issues of racial justice. And to a certain extent, the other kinds of big issues that I think have been very influential have been around gender equality and inclusion of women, around LGBT issues. There are signs that those things are, that people are engaging with them. That's not the same thing as change, but it's I think the precondition for it. And I was very encouraged to see the American Economics Association take a strong stand on in solidarity with protesters in the Black Lives movement, Black Lives Matter movement. That was big, given the history of the AEA and how it has dealt with it. I think we've had a few leaders of that organization who have been very influential in making that a priority. And I think we should all be joining with the AEA, even if you don't identify very much with the AEA, but joining with the AEA to try to make that happen and to think hard about what that means in our individual universities where we live and work, and how we are going to actually be the people who will make that space to be inclusive. And so I guess that's where I would want to, kind of leave my own contribution to this conversation, which is that it is a process. We may not know where we've been successful for many years to see what happens, but I think we can show people that economics is a field that they should want to study if they want to make these kinds of changes, and we should provide that people with the education to do that, and we should all be doing it as well. So again, thanks to Econ for getting us, for having this conversation at this moment in time, and for inviting me to be part of it. Thanks.
Thank you, Lee. Lynn?
Thanks, Hannah. I'll be quick because I'm very conscious of time. Going to Barbara's question, I think the project is much more difficult, but that's not to say that we don't do anything about it. I think we recognise and delineate why the project's more difficult, and think outside the square with new strategies. The same old is not going to work, and it hasn't worked in the past. Going to Howard's question, incentives and power structures seem to be largely intact. What was missed? What was missed is they haven't been dismantled. They've been further institutionalised, and that's the key lesson that I think comes out of the 2008 Great Recession, or GFC. We need to recognise the institutionalisation of those incentives and power structures that have occurred, and ensure that things like decolonisation doesn't get mainstreamed and then used in an institutional way that takes it away from what it's intended to do. What I mean by that, if it gets abrogated by, e.g., management structures in higher education, it will not achieve what we want it to do. Also, I'd add, there needs to be transformation plans, and I think that's also what we missed from the GFC. We didn't have good transformation plans to dismantle those incentives and power structures. And just finally, totally agree, we should be making positionality statements. We should reflect on our positionality. Otherwise, we can't do things like what Scott suggested is that role of the public intellectual. I totally agree with Lee's comments about processes of change, but I would add, in conclusion to this panel, let's not lose the momentum that these opportunities at ASSA have created in the last few days. It's usually like conferences, you go home, you feel really good, and then there's this big void. Let's not lose the momentum and see how we can build very quickly on, and sure, not too ambitious gains, but some reflection on what gains we can achieve pretty quickly. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. Jayati?
Thanks. I'm going to be brief because I actually agree with everything that Lee and Lynn said. I think we failed after the great global financial crisis because these are really powerful power structures. And it's not just that economics as a discipline reflects power structures, it has historically been in the service of power. So it's not surprising. I think the issue is, how do you get enough power on the other side, which really means how much you can capture the imagination of ordinary people. And there it goes back to the point that Lynn Wood and Lynn also made, that we have to be connecting not just with our local communities, but as far as as Lee has been saying, we have to be as public as possible. We have to make as much noise as possible. And we have to do it in every possible way. I mean, it doesn't matter. We can't say, I won't touch this or I won't do that. We have to just do as much as we can in terms of making these issues part of the so-called mainstream and bringing these perspectives and arguments into the public discourse much more broadly so that they do capture the public imagination. And finally, I would just say that means we have to be willing to associate with, work with, and interact with a whole bunch of people we wouldn't normally do. We have to hold our nose and hang out with some, and not hold our nose, but just be willing to engage with a bunch of others. We have to build broader coalitions than just our own little group of like-minded people as well.
Linwood?
To Howard's question, I was in Zuccotti Park during Occupy Wall Street. And it was in the winter was coming. And the prognosis for the winter was that, the occupiers, at least some of them, were going to stay in the park. The New York Police Department was making it very difficult. They were confiscating sleeping bags and heaters and other kinds of things. And you know, I had some discussion with some of the leaders, and that's not the proper term. It's not the term they want to use. But I had a conversation with them, and I proposed that perhaps the park wasn't really the important thing, holding the park over the winter. It might be very difficult to do. I suggested that one of the things that they could do over the winter was to go out and fan out into communities in New York. There are lots of communities, hundreds of different ethnic communities in New York City. All of them, in one way or another, have issues with Wall Street. Yeah, coming from the countries that they fled, that were devastated by various kinds of financial schemes, coming to the U.S. because they wanted to escape that and make a better life for their families. They all of those communities had something of a grievance with Wall Street and with the kind of practices of fraud and other kinds of things that led to the financial crisis. I advise that if they did that, they could hold their meetings in local churches and local houses and so forth, and be in the process of being that public intellectual, if you will, that Scott mentioned, but also of organizing. And then in the spring, you come back en masse. In other words, I get back to I think what we all agree upon. If we're going to project power to the power, then that power has to come from people, because it's not going to come from finance on our side. We don't have enough money to influence things in the way that those with power have.